Power always wears a mask, and this is something that people often fail to recognize when they're swept up in the narratives of politics, media, or international relations. When the United States decides to ban an Indian company, it rarely presents the act as a raw expression of power. Instead, it cloaks the move under the language of national security, consumer safety, or protecting freedom. But human beings have been playing this game since the beginning of civilization. We hide our dominance behind noble-sounding words. Ancient kings justified conquest as divine will. Empires justified exploitation as civilizing missions. And modern governments justify bans as protecting democracy. The truth, however, remains the same. Power seeks to maintain itself, and it does so most effectively when it convinces others that its moves are benevolent. Once you begin to see this pattern, you realize that geopolitics is less about ideals and more about hierarchies of control. The mask of power is necessary because naked dominance provokes resistance. If a nation said outright, "We're banning your companies because your success threatens our economic supremacy," then opposition would arise not only abroad but also at home. People rally against obvious unfairness. That's why masks are vital. A ban is sold as a moral duty to the public, so that the public feels they are part of a righteous cause. The brilliance of such a disguise is that it doesn't just fool the masses, it fools the policymakers too. They begin to believe their own propaganda. They start to see control as compassion, domination as justice, and suppression as security. This is why power is so dangerous. It lies to others and then it lies to itself. Once that cycle begins, almost any act of control can be justified, and almost any challenger can be painted as a threat. It is important to remember that human beings evolved within hierarchies. Every tribe, every society, every civilization created dominant structures, and these hierarchies demanded stories to sustain them. We are meaning-making creatures, and we require narratives that justify our behavior. When America bans an Indian company, it doesn't just make a strategic move, it also creates a story about why the move is necessary. That story is crucial because it gives legitimacy to the act. But this is exactly how power has always worked, not only at the level of nations, but at the level of individuals. In your workplace, when someone undermines you, they rarely admit they feel threatened by your competence. Instead, they rationalize. They invent a story where their sabotage appears justified. This parallel between the individual and the geopolitical reveals a universal principle. Power, to sustain itself, must constantly put on disguises. The irony is that these masks often become more powerful than the reality they conceal. Once the narrative of security or fairness is accepted, the actual truth is irrelevant. People will fight wars, support sanctions, and cheer for bans without ever questioning whether the justification is valid. This reveals a tragic dimension of human psychology. We would rather believe a comfortable lie than confront a disturbing truth. If the truth is that America fears competition, that shatters the myth of its invincibility. If the truth is that Indian companies are growing too powerful, that forces people to reconsider the balance of global order. And so, both individuals and nations prefer the mask because it maintains stability, but stability bought at the cost of truth is fragile. It eventually cracks, and when it does, the backlash can be immense, both politically and personally. Consider the historical patterns. Every empire, no matter how vast, has justified its control through narratives of righteousness. The Romans claimed they were spreading order. The British claimed they were spreading civilization. The Soviets claimed they were spreading equality. The Americans today claim they are spreading freedom and security. Each one believed its own story, and each one used that story to suppress competitors. Indian companies today are caught in that cycle, just as countless civilizations before were caught. The bans placed on them are not accidents of policy. They are continuations of a timeless human strategy to disguise fear as morality and to portray suppression as protection. The surface changes, but the psychological and political mechanism remains the same. But what does this mean for the individual? It means you must develop the capacity to see through masks in your own life. When someone criticizes you harshly, is it always because you are wrong? Or could it be that your competence is exposing their inadequacy? When a group excludes you, is it always because you are unworthy? Or could it be that your presence threatens their dominance? Nations and individuals operate under the same psychological framework. The mask is universal. Recognizing this is a form of awakening. It teaches you not to take every rejection at face value, not to internalize every criticism, and not to assume that power structures are fair. Most often they are not. They are crafted to maintain control, and control always hides behind justifications. There is also a deeper lesson about human vulnerability to stories. Our brains are wired for narrative, and that makes us susceptible to manipulation. Governments understand this. Corporations understand this. And even individuals who wield social power understand this. They know that if they can control the story, they can control the perception of their actions. This is why propaganda works, why cancel culture thrives, and why bans are so easily accepted. People don't ask, "Is this fair?" They ask, "Does this fit the story I already believe?" Once the story is set, power can act with minimal resistance. The mask is not just something placed upon us. It is something we willingly wear, because it shields us from uncomfortable truths about the world. At the same time, masks reveal the insecurity of those who wear them. If power were absolute, if dominance were uncontested, there would be no need for disguises. The fact that America has to justify its bans shows that it recognizes India's growing strength. Suppression is never directed at the irrelevant. It is directed at the rising. Just as bullies don't attack the weak, but the promising great powers don't expend energy suppressing the insignificant. They focus on the ones who threaten their position. That is both the tragedy and the triumph of these bans. Tragedy because they limit potential, triumph because they signal recognition. The very act of banning is an admission of fear. It is the mask that betrays the truth. If you wish to live wisely in such a world, you must train yourself to pierce the veil of appearances. This does not mean becoming cynical, but it does mean becoming attentive. When you hear justifications, ask yourself, what power dynamic lies beneath this? When you see suppression, ask, what potential is being feared here? This shift in perception allows you to see reality with more clarity, and clarity is power in itself. Because once you understand that masks are inevitable, you no longer feel deceived by them. You begin to recognize that beneath every story lies the raw, unvarnished fact of human competition. And in that recognition, you can orient yourself better, whether as an individual navigating life or as a nation navigating geopolitics. Competence is one of the most dangerous things you can possess, because it immediately destabilizes the fragile hierarchies around you. When you become competent, you disrupt the balance of mediocrity that others rely on for their sense of order. The world, at every level, is filled with people and institutions that cling to stability, even if that stability is based on weakness. So when someone rises, when a company grows beyond expectations, or when a nation begins to show signs of strength, resistance emerges almost instantly. That resistance is rarely framed as jealousy or fear. Instead, it is presented as criticism, regulation, or suppression. Yet the truth remains the same. Competence attracts opposition. The stronger you get, the more likely others are to feel threatened. This is as true for Indian companies as it is for individuals navigating their own lives. The irony is that the very qualities that make you admirable also make you a target. When you demonstrate skill, others admire you, but admiration is often mixed with resentment. They see in you what they could be, but have not yet become, and that comparison makes them uncomfortable. Instead of rising to the challenge themselves, many people attempt to drag the competent back down. It is easier to criticize than to improve, easier to restrict than to compete, easier to ban than to innovate. At the level of nations, this psychology is magnified. The United States resists not because Indian companies are weak, but precisely because they are proving themselves capable. Competence unsettles the established order, and the established order fights back. This is the eternal drama of growth in a competitive world. Think about it in terms of personal development. When you begin to improve yourself, maybe you start working harder, learning more, or disciplining your habits. Not everyone around you will celebrate. Some will feel exposed, as if your progress highlights their stagnation. They will say you've changed, or that you're arrogant, or that you don't fit in anymore. But what they really mean is that your competence threatens their comfort. The same principle applies to Indian companies. As they expand into global markets, their success highlights the vulnerabilities of long-established giants. That's why bans are framed as protection. They are shields used by the insecure to hide from the uncomfortable reality that someone else is doing better. Competence never exists in a vacuum. It always creates ripples. What makes competence even more threatening is that it cannot be easily destroyed once it takes root. A person who knows how to think, or a company that knows how to innovate, cannot simply be erased with opposition. They may be slowed, but they cannot be unlearned or undone. That resilience is terrifying to those who cling to dominance. When America bans Indian companies, it is not really stopping them from being competent. It is only trying to delay their inevitable rise. The same is true for individuals. When people resist your competence, they are not actually diminishing your ability. They are attempting to create obstacles, hoping you will give up before you fully realize your potential. The danger is not their resistance itself, but whether you allow it to weaken your resolve. Competence also shines an unforgiving light on incompetence. This is why it provokes hostility. The moment you raise the bar, you make the existing standard look outdated. A student who excels in the classroom makes the average seem mediocre. A company that produces better results exposes inefficiencies in its competitors. A nation that advances in technology challenges the assumption that dominance is permanent. This exposure is intolerable to those who have built their identity on being at the top. It feels like a threat to their survival, even if it is only a challenge to their pride. And so, instead of celebrating competence, they frame it as dangerous, disruptive, or unfair. The mask of morality hides the sting of insecurity. At the same time, competence is also magnetic. People who truly value excellence are drawn to it, and they want to learn from it. But those who live in fear of change are repelled by it, and they prefer to attack it. That duality is inevitable. For Indian companies, the bans may seem like obstacles, but they are also proof that their competence is real enough to attract global attention. In the life of an individual, this same paradox plays out. When you improve, you will gain admirers who want to grow with you, but you will also gain enemies who want to stop you. The fact that you have enemies at all is not a sign of failure. It is a signal that you are moving in the right direction. Competence divides people, and that division is part of its power. If you reflect deeply, you'll see that resistance is not a punishment for competence, but a test of it. Competence that crumbles under pressure is not competence at all. It's a fragile illusion. True competence grows stronger when resisted, because it adapts, innovates, and endures. Indian companies facing bans now have the opportunity to become even more resilient. Instead of relying on access to one market, they can build alternative systems, diversify, and strengthen themselves. Likewise, when your competence is challenged, you can either shrink back into mediocrity or push forward into mastery. Resistance is the sharpening stone. It feels like opposition, but it functions as refinement. The stronger the resistance, the sharper you become. Another dimension is that competence reveals the deep unfairness of the world. We are taught that success is always rewarded, but reality is harsher. Success is rewarded and punished simultaneously. You may achieve something extraordinary, and instead of universal praise, you encounter envy, regulation, or sabotage. That contradiction can be disorienting, and many people give up at that stage. They believe they must have done something wrong if others are opposing them. But that is the wrong interpretation. The opposition is evidence of success, not failure. If no one resists you, it's because you haven't changed anything significant. Competence is disruptive by its very nature, and disruption will always draw resistance. There is also a profound personal lesson here. If you are going to pursue competence, you must be prepared for resistance as part of the bargain. You cannot wish for growth without also inviting opposition. The two are inseparable. This doesn't mean you should avoid becoming competent. It means you should cultivate resilience to withstand the backlash. For Indian companies, resilience means continuing to innovate despite bans. For individuals, it means continuing to discipline yourself despite criticism. The path of competence is the path of resistance, and knowing that in advance allows you to endure it without bitterness. Opposition becomes less of a shock and more of a confirmation that you're moving in the right direction. Ultimately, competence is both a gift and a burden. It gives you the ability to rise, to achieve, and to inspire, but it also guarantees that you will face opposition from those who feel threatened. The world resists competence because it destabilizes what is familiar. Yet without competence, nothing ever improves. The paradox is clear. We resist the very thing that could make us better. That paradox plays out in geopolitics when America bans Indian companies, and it plays out in daily life when individuals undermine those who rise above. The lesson is not to abandon competence, but to understand its cost. Competence will always invite resistance, and the only way to honor it is to keep moving forward despite that fact. Pressure is one of the most misunderstood forces in human existence. We often see it as something purely destructive, something designed to crush or break us. But pressure, in its deepest form, is also the thing that shapes us into who we are meant to be. Without resistance, without challenges, without opposition, the self never fully emerges. The same is true for nations and companies. When India's rising companies face bans or restrictions, they are forced to ask fundamental questions about themselves. What do we stand for? What can we build without reliance on others? How do we survive when pathways are blocked? These questions are painful, but they are also formative. Pressure doesn't just test, it defines. Consider the individual. When life is easy, when there are no challenges, identity remains shallow. You don't know who you are until you are tested. A student who never fails never learns the meaning of perseverance. A worker who never faces obstacles never discovers the value of resilience. A person who never suffers never discovers their depth. Likewise, a company that never faces bans or global pushback never discovers its true capacity for innovation. It is precisely the limitations, the blockages, and the restrictions that force creativity to emerge. Just as coal becomes diamond under intense pressure, identity crystallizes in moments of struggle. Without pressure, we remain formless, undefined, and weak. Nations, too, discover their identity under pressure. India today is experiencing the weight of geopolitical resistance. When its companies are targeted, it can feel unfair, even humiliating. But hidden within that resistance lies an opportunity for definition. Will India crumble under the weight, dependent forever on the approval of foreign powers, or will it rise with greater independence, forging its own technological path? Pressure asks those questions relentlessly, and the answers determine not only economic strength, but cultural identity. The story of who India is becoming is written not in times of comfort, but in times of confrontation. And that is how identity is truly formed. At the individual level, pressure strips away illusions. You may believe you are strong, disciplined, or courageous, but until you are placed in a crucible, those beliefs are untested. Pressure reveals the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. This can be brutal, because it forces you to confront weaknesses you would rather ignore. Yet, it is precisely in that confrontation that growth occurs. A person who fails and rises again becomes more real, more grounded, more authentic. The same is true of companies and nations. When Indian businesses face bans, they cannot lean on fantasy. They must confront reality directly, adapt, and discover their true potential. Identity is the residue of all the pressures we survive. Another aspect of pressure is that it demands choice. When you are comfortable, you can drift, you can delay decisions, you can live in ambiguity. But when pressure mounts, ambiguity collapses. You are forced to choose a direction, forced to decide what matters. For Indian companies facing bans, the choice becomes clear. Either adapt and innovate, or fade into irrelevance. For individuals, the choice is equally stark. Either take responsibility and grow, or collapse into resentment and despair. Pressure removes the luxury of hesitation. It insists that you define yourself through action, and action under pressure is the most honest form of expression. The paradox of pressure is that while it feels destructive, it is secretly constructive. Think of the weight a tree endures as it grows. The wind bends it, storms beat it, and the soil resists its roots. But without those forces, the tree would never grow strong. A life without pressure is not freedom, it is weakness disguised as ease. A nation without resistance stagnates, just as a person without struggle remains childish. India's identity, forged through bans and restrictions, is being shaped into something stronger than it could have been without them. Likewise, your identity, shaped by obstacles, becomes sharper and more defined. The world may think it is suppressing you, but it is often unknowingly strengthening you. There is also a moral dimension to pressure. It exposes character. When things go wrong, when pressure mounts, do you become bitter and cynical, or do you rise with courage and clarity? That choice reveals more about you than success ever could. Success hides flaws, but pressure exposes them. Nations under pressure reveal their values. Do they betray their own people to appease others, or do they stand firm and build alternatives? Companies under pressure reveal their vision. Do they abandon innovation to survive in the short term, or do they double down on long-term goals? Individuals under pressure reveal their soul. Do they hide or do they grow? Identity is never neutral. It is carved by the choices made under weight. Pressure also binds communities together. When people face resistance as a group, they either fracture or unify. Shared struggle creates solidarity, because it reminds people of what they are fighting for. Indian companies facing bans may discover a collective purpose: to prove that they cannot be silenced, to build ecosystems independent of foreign approval. Similarly, when families, teams, or societies endure hardship, they often emerge stronger together. The bonds created in pressure are thicker than those created in comfort. Identity, then, is not only individual but collective. It is the shared story of what we endured and what we overcame. Finally, pressure is the only real path to transformation. You cannot become something new without leaving behind what you were. That process is uncomfortable, sometimes agonizing, but it is also the essence of growth. For India, bans are not just obstacles, they are catalysts. They force a transformation from dependency to self-reliance, from imitation to innovation, from follower to leader. For the individual, pressure forces the transformation from potential to reality, from weakness to strength, from immaturity to maturity. The shaping is painful, but the result is identity. You do not know who you are until the world pushes against you. And when you discover that truth under pressure, you become something more than you were before. When we look at the grand stage of geopolitics, it is easy to see it as something far away, something disconnected from the individual life. Nations clash, corporations rise and fall, and governments impose sanctions. It all seems abstract, like the movements of giants beyond our reach. But the truth is that these large-scale events mirror the same psychological realities that each of us faces in our own lives. The patterns are identical, only magnified. The resistance India faces from the United States is no different, in principle, from the resistance you face when you try to improve yourself. The lesson is clear. The struggle between nations is a reflection of the struggle within individuals, and if you understand the dynamics of one, you can understand the dynamics of the other. At its core, geopolitics is about fear, competition, and dominance. The United States resists India's rise not out of hatred, but because that rise threatens its position. This is the same reason an individual resists the growth of another. You see this in families, in workplaces, in friendships. When you begin to discipline yourself, when you start building competence, others around you may feel overshadowed. They will respond with criticism or distance, sometimes even with hostility. The world is not kind to growth, because growth destabilizes what is familiar. The bans against Indian companies are not personal. They are the inevitable reaction to the unsettling force of progress. This is exactly what you encounter when you rise in your own life. The individual lesson is that opposition is not proof of failure, but of significance. If no one resists you, it means you have not disturbed anything important. Nations that do not rise are ignored. People who do not grow are overlooked. The presence of resistance indicates that your actions are meaningful enough to be noticed. That truth can change the way you interpret obstacles. Instead of seeing them as signs you are on the wrong path, you can see them as confirmations that you are moving in the right direction. For Indian companies, the bans are recognition of their strength. For you, the resistance of others is recognition of your potential. The key is to learn to interpret these signals correctly, instead of being crushed by them. Another dimension of this is responsibility. Nations that face pressure cannot afford to collapse into victimhood, because victimhood weakens identity. If India interprets bans as unfairness and nothing more, it risks bitterness and stagnation. But if it interprets them as a call to become stronger, it transforms resistance into fuel. The same applies to individuals. You can resent those who oppose you, or you can take responsibility for your growth and adapt. Responsibility transforms the narrative from "they are holding me back" to "I must rise regardless." That shift is essential because resentment corrodes, but responsibility builds. The individual lesson from geopolitics is simple. Take responsibility for your response, even when pressure feels unjust. Geopolitical struggles also reveal the necessity of resilience. When one path is blocked, nations must build another. When one market is closed, companies must create alternatives. This mirrors the resilience required of individuals. When a door closes in your life, you must find another way forward. The refusal to adapt is a refusal to live. Indian companies, faced with bans, have the chance to innovate beyond dependence. You, faced with resistance, have the chance to reinvent yourself. Resilience is the art of refusing to give up when the obvious path disappears. It is a skill both nations and people need if they are to thrive in a world defined by constant competition and uncertainty. There is also a moral lesson embedded in geopolitics. Power respects strength more than it respects weakness. The United States does not resist weak nations because weakness is no threat. It resists strong ones because strength demands attention. In your own life, this truth applies as well. If you are weak, people will ignore you. If you are strong, they will resist you, and that resistance is a kind of backhanded respect. It means you matter. The implication is profound. You should not aim to be invisible by avoiding conflict. You should aim to be strong enough that your presence forces recognition. Nations gain respect by becoming competent. Individuals gain respect by becoming responsible. Strength is the foundation of dignity. The battles between nations also reveal the danger of illusions. Every country tells itself a story about why it acts as it does. The United States says it is protecting freedom. India says it is rising fairly. Each side frames its actions in moral language, because people cannot live without narratives. The same is true in your life. When you face resistance, you will be tempted to create stories of persecution or injustice. But those stories can trap you if they are not rooted in truth. The challenge is to see clearly, to ask, what is really happening here? Am I being resisted because I am wrong, or because I am becoming strong? Clarity is essential, because the story you choose will shape how you act in response. Another lesson is the inevitability of competition. Nations cannot avoid it, and neither can individuals. The dream of living without conflict is childish. To exist is to compete for resources, for attention, for survival. The question is not whether you will face competition, but how you will respond when it comes. India cannot wish away American resistance. It must respond with innovation and determination. You cannot wish away the envy or opposition of others. You must respond with resilience and strength. The inevitability of competition should not make you despair. It should make you serious. Life is not a playground, but a battleground, and to deny that is to leave yourself unprepared. Geopolitics teaches another crucial principle. Transformation under pressure is possible only if you are willing to embrace suffering. Nations grow not in times of peace, but in times of trial. Individuals grow not when life is comfortable, but when it is difficult. Suffering, if approached properly, refines you. It cuts away arrogance, naivety, and weakness, leaving behind something sharper and stronger. The suffering caused by bans can push Indian companies to innovate faster, to create industries that are independent of external control. The suffering caused by resistance in your own life can push you to discover strengths you did not know you possessed. The lesson is that suffering is not meaningless. It is the birthplace of transformation. Finally, geopolitics shows us that the struggle for recognition is universal. Nations want to be seen, to be acknowledged as legitimate, to be respected. People want the same thing. We all desire recognition, from peers, from family, from society. And the path to recognition is always the same. Become competent, take responsibility, and endure resistance. Nations cannot demand respect. They must earn it by rising. Individuals cannot demand dignity. They must earn it by shouldering the weight of their existence. The battles between countries are reflections of the battles within ourselves. If you pay attention, every geopolitical event carries with it a mirror, showing you how to live more truthfully, more responsibly, and more courageously in your own life.